Hacker News Weekly Podcast, Top 10 Stories, July 20th through 26th, 2025. Welcome back to the Hacker News Weekly, where we dive into the most engaging, controversial, and thought-provoking stories from the past week on Hacker News. This week, we reviewed over 210 stories posted between July 20th and 26th, and we've curated the absolute best, the ones that sparked the most passionate debates, revealed fascinating innovations, and challenged how we think about technology. From the ongoing battle between web and mobile apps to brand new robotics innovations, from the collapse of the open web to security nightmares that just won't stop, we've got a packed episode that captures the zeitgeist of the tech community right now. These aren't just the highest voted stories, these are the conversations that defined the week, with thousands of comments revealing deep tensions and exciting possibilities in our industry. So let's dive in, starting with a story that I guarantee every single one of you has experienced firsthand. All right, now we're diving into something that I bet every single one of you has experienced. Our first story is titled, "Do Not Download the App, Use the Website." And wow, did this one strike a nerve on Hacker News with over 1,300 points and more than 700 comments. You know that feeling when you're just trying to quickly check something on Reddit or LinkedIn on your phone's browser and the site keeps nagging you, sometimes even tricking you into downloading their app? Yeah, turns out there's a whole dark pattern playbook behind this, and the community has some really fascinating takes on why this is happening. So the author draws this brilliant parallel between the 2010s mobile-first buzzword era and today's AI-first hype cycle. Remember when every startup pitch deck had to have mobile-first plastered all over it? The author is suggesting we're seeing the same kind of bubble behavior now with AI, where it's more about following trends than actually solving user problems. But here's where it gets even interesting. That mobile-first push from a decade ago has morphed into something way more insidious. These companies aren't pushing apps because they're better, and let's be honest, half the time they're actually worse than the mobile website. No, it's all about data access. When you're using a website through your browser, there's this beautiful sandbox that limits what companies can vacuum up from your device. But an app? That's a different story. We're talking access to your contacts, your location data, device identifiers, sometimes even your photo library. The list goes on. Reddit's probably the worst offender here. They'll literally show you a few comments on mobile web and then blur out the rest, demanding you download the app to keep reading. LinkedIn does this thing where certain features just mysteriously don't work on mobile web. And don't even get me started on Pinterest. Try saving an image from their mobile site without the app. It's like they've weaponized user frustration as a growth strategy. But here's where the discussion gets really juicy. Not everyone agrees with the premise. There's this fascinating comment from someone who runs Auto Tempest, a car search site, and their experience completely flips the narrative. They built a fully functional mobile website, didn't push their app at all, just had a small banner mentioning it existed. And you know what happened? Users demanded the app. They actively chose to download it, and about half their mobile traffic voluntarily migrated over. No dark patterns, no coercion, just preference. This sparked a whole debate about whether we're maybe being a bit too cynical. Some folks pointed out that native apps genuinely can provide smoother experiences, better animations, offline functionality, push notifications that actually work properly. One commenter, Mark BAO, made this point that web apps can be just as invasive with permissions these days. Ever noticed how many websites ask for your location, camera access, notification permissions? The sandbox isn't as restrictive as we might think. But then we get to the really concerning stuff. Banking apps, authentication apps. These are becoming mandatory with no web fallback whatsoever. One commenter mentioned their bank's website literally just displays a QR code that opens the app. That's it. That's the entire website. We're moving toward this world where having a smartphone with specific apps installed isn't just convenient, it's compulsory for participating in modern society. And this raises some uncomfortable questions, right? What about people with older phones that can't run the latest apps? What about folks who want to use a desktop computer for their banking?
There's this comment about someone's elderly parents who can barely manage their flip phone, and now they're being told they need a smartphone just to access their bank account. The privacy implications are staggering, too. Multiple people in the thread shared stories about apps requesting absurd permissions, a shopping app wanting access to your contacts, a restaurant app demanding location access even when you're not using it. One particularly eye-opening comment talked about how TikTok's app can technically access every keystroke you make in their in-app browser. That's not a bug. That's a feature from their perspective.
What really gets me is this fundamental tension the discussion reveals. On one hand, users genuinely do seem to prefer native apps for certain things. They're searching for them, downloading them voluntarily, using them more than web versions. But on the other hand, companies are absolutely exploiting this preference to create these walled gardens where they can harvest data and lock users into their ecosystems. The whole thing makes you wonder if we're witnessing the slow death of the open web. When every company wants you in their app silo rather than on their website, when essential services require app installation, when the mobile web experience is deliberately degraded to push app adoption, where does that leave us? Are we heading toward a future where the web is just a discovery layer for apps rather than a platform in its own right? It's fascinating and frustrating in equal measure. And judging by those 700+ comments, I'm definitely not alone in feeling that way. Speaking of the evolution of web technologies and how they're changing our digital landscape, this connects perfectly to another massive debate that erupted this week. All right, so our next story is, it's time for modern CSS to kill the SPA. And with 744 points and nearly 500 comments, you know this one struck a nerve. So here's the thing. This author is basically saying we've all been doing it wrong for the past decade. They're arguing that the whole reason we started building these complex single-page applications, your React apps, your Vue apps, all that JavaScript-heavy stuff, was to get those smooth app-like page transitions. And now? Well, apparently CSS can do all that natively, so why are we still torturing ourselves with all this complexity? The author makes this really interesting observation about how these massive technical decisions often come down to one non-technical person in a meeting saying, "Make it feel like an app." And boom, suddenly you're locked into a React architecture. You're dealing with client-side routing, state management, hydration issues, the whole 9 yards. All because someone wanted a fancy page transition that, according to this article, you could have just done with some CSS. And they're not pulling punches here. They describe most SPAs as delivering, and I quote, "a page transition that looks smooth until you realize it's just fading between two loading states." Ouch. They're talking about broken scroll restoration, delayed navigation, all these promises of a polished experience that just don't materialize in the real world.
But here's where it gets really interesting. The Hacker News crowd is not having it. The pushback in the comments is intense, and honestly, they make some compelling points. The consensus seems to be that this author fundamentally misunderstands why we build SPAs in the first place. One commenter put it perfectly. They said SPAs were never really about the transitions. It's about handling complex interactivity, managing state across long user sessions, filtering and sorting data without constantly hitting the server. Think about something like Gmail or Google Docs. You're not rebuilding those with CSS transitions and server-side rendering, right? These are legitimately complex applications that need that client-side architecture. There's also this fascinating thread about how the article seems to be fighting yesterday's war. Several developers pointed out that frameworks like Next.js have actually been pushing us back towards server-side rendering in multi-page architectures anyway. We're not in the pure SPA world of 2015 anymore. The pendulum has already swung back somewhat. But, and this is important, there's definitely a contingent that agrees with the core criticism, even if they think the framing is off. Multiple people shared horror stories about simple marketing sites built with hundreds of megabytes of React dependencies, or banking websites that became completely unusable after being converted to SPAs. One person mentioned their bank site now takes forever to load, breaks the back button, and somehow manages to be slower than the old server-rendered version it replaced. What really strikes me about this whole debate is how it highlights this disconnect between what we think we're building and what users actually experience. In theory, SPAs give us this fluid, responsive, app-like experience. In practice, well, apparently we're often just shipping bloated, broken websites that would have been better off as simple HTML and CSS. The timing of this article is interesting too. We're in this moment where the JavaScript ecosystem is more powerful than ever, but there's also this growing fatigue with complexity. You've got people rediscovering the joy of just shipping HTML, tools like HTMX gaining traction, and now CSS becoming powerful enough to handle animations and transitions that used to require JavaScript. I think the real takeaway here isn't that CSS is going to kill SPAs. That's obviously hyperbolic. But it does raise valid questions about when we actually need all that complexity. Are we choosing SPAs because they're the right tool for the job, or just because that's what we know? Are we solving real user problems, or just creating interesting engineering challenges for ourselves?
The discussion also revealed something fascinating about how these decisions actually get made in organizations. That bit about the non-technical stakeholders saying, make it feel like an app, really resonated with people. How many architectural decisions are driven by these vague requirements that could probably be satisfied with much simpler solutions? At the end of the day, this feels like one of those debates that's really about finding the right tool for the job. Complex web applications with rich interactivity, yeah, you probably still need that SPA architecture, but your company's marketing site or your blog, maybe, just maybe, you don't need React for that. And speaking of debates about whether our technology choices are actually helping or hurting us, let's talk about what happens when those choices have real economic consequences. All right, so now we need to talk about something that's got the Hacker News community absolutely fired up. AI overviews cause massive drop in search clicks. This one really blew up on Hacker News with over 750 points and nearly 850 comments. And honestly, I can see why everyone's freaking out. So here's what's happening. Google's been rolling out these AI-generated overviews at the top of search results. You know, those little summaries that give you the answer right there without clicking through to any website. And apparently, they're causing website traffic to crater by something like 40%. That's not a typo, 40%. Now, the community reaction on this is fascinating because it's completely split down the middle. On one side, you've got people who are basically saying good riddance to clicking through to websites. There's this user, Ripped Britches, who makes an interesting point. They're arguing that if people prefer the AI overview to clicking through, maybe those websites weren't providing enough value in the first place. And honestly, when you think about what the modern web has become, they might have a point. I mean, let's be real for a second. When was the last time you clicked on a recipe website and didn't want to throw your laptop out the window? You're scrolling through someone's life story about their grandmother's kitchen in Vermont, dodging auto-playing videos, fighting off newsletter pop-ups, accepting cookie banners. All you wanted was to know how long to bake the chicken. So yeah, I get why some people see these AI overviews as a blessed relief. But here's where it gets complicated, and this is what's really concerning a lot of folks in the discussion. These AI overviews, they're often wrong, like confidently, authoritatively wrong. And when Google presents incorrect information right at the top of the search results, who do you complain to? There's no website to contact, no author to correct. The misinformation just sits there. Several commenters shared horror stories about this, organizations finding completely false information about themselves in these overviews, technical documentation being misrepresented, medical information that's just flat out dangerous. And the really scary part, most users probably don't even realize they're getting AI-generated content. They just see it at the top of Google and assume it's authoritative. But the deeper issue here, and this is what's got people really worried, is about the fundamental economics of the internet. Websites create content because they can monetize traffic through ads, subscriptions, whatever. Google crawls that content, and traditionally, they'd send traffic back to those sites. It was symbiotic, right?
But now, Google's essentially taking that content, feeding it to an AI, and serving up the summary without sending any traffic back. One commenter called it the largest theft of intellectual property in human history, which, okay, that might be a bit dramatic, but you can see where they're coming from. If websites aren't getting traffic, they can't make money. If they can't make money, they stop creating content. And if they stop creating content, what exactly is Google's AI going to train on in the future? It's like we're watching the internet eat itself. There's this user, Peter Stewart, who had an interesting take, though. They called AI overviews a godsend for non-technical users. Their argument is that a lot of people, especially older folks or people who aren't super tech-savvy, they struggle with crafting good search queries. The AI overview gives them something useful, even if their search terms weren't perfect. And you know what? That's actually a pretty valid point about accessibility. But then we circle back to the accuracy problem. If these overviews are helping non-technical users, but feeding them incorrect information, is that really helping? It's almost worse because those users might not have the context to know when the AI is hallucinating. The whole situation feels like we're at this inflection point for the web. Either we're moving toward a future where AI intermediaries handle all our information consumption, for better or worse, or we're about to see a massive backlash and restructuring of how content gets created and monetized online.
What really strikes me about this discussion is that nobody seems to have a good solution. Even the people defending the AI overviews acknowledge the problems with accuracy and economic sustainability. And the critics, well, they're not wrong about the issues, but they also can't deny that users seem to prefer not dealing with the modern web's hostile design patterns. It's messy, it's complicated, and it's happening right now, whether we're ready for it or not. The 40% traffic drop isn't just a statistic. It's potentially the beginning of a fundamental shift in how the internet works. And judging by those 845 comments, nobody really knows where this is heading. All right, so our next story is about Graphene OS, a security-enhanced Android build that's been getting a ton of attention on Hacker News, with over 700 points in more than 500 comments. And you know what? This one has a really fascinating backstory that reads almost like a tech thriller. So Graphene OS is essentially Android rebuilt from the ground up with privacy and security as the absolute top priorities. But here's where it gets interesting. This project actually rose from the ashes of something called Copperhead OS, which completely imploded back in 2018 after what's been described as an ugly dispute between the founders. Daniel McKay, who was one of those original founders, basically took the work and continued it independently, eventually creating what we now know as Graphene OS. What they're doing is taking the Android Open Source Project, AOSP, and then ruthlessly cutting out anything they consider unnecessary, while simultaneously adding layer after layer of security enhancements. We're talking about hardening the memory allocator, improving sandboxing, adding network permission toggles that Android should have had years ago. It's like they're building a fortress where stock Android is more like a house with the windows open. Now, here's something that caught my eye. The project is supposedly backed by a Canadian foundation that was created in 2023, but there's almost no public information about this organization. For a privacy-focused project, it's either perfectly on brand or slightly concerning, depending on how you look at it. The community seems split on whether this opacity is a feature or a bug. Speaking of the community, the discussion thread is absolutely fascinating. You've got this overwhelming wave of positivity from current users who are basically evangelizing about how Graphene OS has changed their mobile experience. One commenter compared it to the early days of Linux. You know, that feeling of finally having control over your own device again. They're talking about features like being able to grant network permissions on a per-app basis, having multiple user profiles with different security levels, and the ability to completely sandbox apps that you don't trust but still need to use. But here's the kicker, and this is where things get philosophically interesting. Graphene OS only runs on Google Pixel phones. Yeah, you heard that right. The most privacy-focused Android variant requires you to buy hardware from Google, the company many of these users are explicitly trying to escape from. It's like buying a Ford to get away from the automotive industry. The community is having a field day with this irony. Some users are pointing out that Pixel phones have the Titan security chip, Google's proprietary security processor that was supposed to be open-sourced but never was. So you're essentially trusting Google's black box hardware while trying to escape Google's software surveillance. One commenter called this the ultimate privacy paradox. On the practical side, users are reporting some real challenges. GPS and location services can be wonky without Google Play services. NFC payments, forget about it. That's completely off the table. Banking apps are hit or miss, with some working perfectly and others refusing to run on what they detect as a modified device. It's definitely not for your average user who just wants their phone to work. But then you've got power users saying things like, "I've been running Graphene OS for 3 years and I'll never go back." They're sharing elaborate workarounds, alternative app stores, and ways to get most functionality working without any Google services at all. It's like this whole parallel universe of Android apps and services. What really strikes me about this discussion is the tension between pragmatism and principle. You've got people who are willing to deal with significant inconvenience for the sake of privacy, and then others questioning whether the whole exercise is futile if you're still running on Google hardware. One particularly insightful comment suggested that maybe Google doesn't mind Graphene OS existing because it gives privacy-conscious users an outlet while still keeping them in the Google ecosystem.
The technical achievements here are genuinely impressive, though. They've implemented things like storage scopes, contact scopes, sensor permissions, basically taking Android's permission system and cranking it up to 11. Every app can be restricted in ways that stock Android would never allow. Want Instagram to work, but not have access to your contacts, storage, or sensors? Graphene OS lets you do that. There's also this interesting discussion about the future viability of projects like this. With Google pushing hardware attestation and banks getting more aggressive about detecting tampered devices, some users worry that Graphene OS might become unusable for daily life in a few years. It's this constant cat-and-mouse game between privacy advocates and the tech establishment. You know what this reminds me of? The whole right-to-repair movement. It's fundamentally about owning the devices you paid for, having control over your digital life. Graphene OS is basically saying, this is your phone. You should decide what it does and doesn't share. In an era where our phones know more about us than we know about ourselves, that's a pretty powerful statement. And speaking of security and the constant battle to protect our data, we can't ignore the elephant in the room when it comes to enterprise security. All right, now we need to talk about something that's got the Hacker News community absolutely fired up. Global hack on Microsoft Sharepoint hits U.S. state agencies, researchers say. This one pulled in over 800 points and more than 400 comments. And honestly, the discussion thread might be more revealing than the hack itself. So here's the thing. We've got another major SharePoint vulnerability being exploited in the wild, targeting government agencies, and the community reaction is basically a collective shrug mixed with seeing frustration. It's like watching people react to yet another data breach notification. There's this exhausted inevitability to it all. What really struck me reading through these comments is how nobody seems surprised anymore. One commenter put it perfectly. They described SharePoint as this Frankenstein's monster of a platform with features just kind of tacked on at different angles over the years, never really designed to be internet-facing in the first place. And yet here we are, with critical government infrastructure running on it. The discussion quickly evolved into this fascinating debate about why Microsoft maintains such a stranglehold on enterprise and government IT despite these constant security failures. And the answer that kept coming up, it's not about technical merit at all. It's about organizational inertia and cover-your-ass decision-making. Nobody gets fired for choosing Microsoft, right? Even when it gets hacked, Again, you can just point to all the other organizations that made the same choice. There's this brutal honesty in the comments about how security isn't actually the top priority for most organizations, despite what they claim. What really matters? Cost, compliance checkboxes, having someone to call when things break, and, crucially, having someone else to blame when things go wrong. Microsoft provides all of that in a nice, enterprise-friendly package. But here's where it gets interesting. Some commenters pushed back on the idea that switching to Linux or open-source alternatives would magically solve these problems. They argue that if Red Hat or any Linux distribution had Microsoft's market share, they'd just become the primary target instead. Right now, they benefit from security through obscurity, not necessarily superior architecture. One particularly insightful comment suggested the real issue might not be Windows versus Linux at all, but rather the whole on-premises versus cloud deployment model and how well these systems are actually maintained. A poorly configured Linux server is just as vulnerable as a poorly configured Windows server, after all. What's really depressing, though, is the resignation in these comments. People who've worked in government IT describe trying to push for better security practices, for alternatives to SharePoint, for anything different, really, and hitting this wall of bureaucratic inertia every single time. The system is optimized for continuity and blame distribution, not for actual security or efficiency. And SharePoint itself, the way people describe working with it, it's like this necessary evil that nobody actually likes but everyone has to use. Multiple commenters who've had to develop for it or maintain it describe it as fundamentally broken at an architectural level, with Microsoft just constantly patching over core design flaws rather than addressing them. The cynicism is palpable when people discuss whether this breach will change anything. The consensus? Absolutely not. There will be some congressional hearings maybe, some strongly worded letters, perhaps a few security patches, and then everyone will go back to using SharePoint. Because, well, what else are they going to do? Retrain thousands of employees? Migrate decades of documents? Risk being the person who chose the alternative that also eventually gets hacked?
It's this perfect storm of vendor lock-in, organizational dysfunction, and misaligned incentives. The people making purchasing decisions aren't the ones dealing with the security implications. The people who understand the technical risks don't have the political capital to change anything. And Microsoft? Well, they'll issue a patch, maybe apologize, and continue collecting those enterprise license fees. You know what's wild? Reading between the lines, it seems like a lot of IT professionals have just accepted this as the cost of doing business in the enterprise world. They've stopped fighting it and started working around it, implementing additional security layers, air-gapping critical systems where possible, and basically treating Microsoft products as inherently compromised from the start. The few optimists in the thread suggested that maybe, just maybe, if these breaches start costing real money in lawsuits or regulatory fines, we might see change. But even they seemed to acknowledge it would take something catastrophic. Not just another breach, but something that fundamentally breaks the current calculus of cheaper to pay for breach insurance than to rebuild our IT infrastructure. It's honestly a masterclass in how technical decisions become political decisions, and how momentum and institutional inertia can override common sense and security best practices. The hack itself is almost beside the point. It's just another data point in this ongoing dysfunction that everyone sees but nobody seems able to fix.
The technical advantages are, well, they're kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. You get zero backlash, which means no play or looseness in the joints. You get what's called high torque transparency. Basically, the robot can feel forces much more precisely. It's got low inertia, it's cheap to build, and, here's the kicker, it's quiet. Like, really quiet. Compared to traditional robot dogs that sound like angry sewing machines. But here's my favorite part of the whole story. Ayad ran into this fascinating engineering problem trying to achieve an exact 8-to-1 gear ratio. He did all the math, built the mechanism, and it didn't work. Why? He forgot to account for the thickness of the rope itself.
It's like, imagine trying to measure the circumference of a circle by wrapping string around it, but forgetting that the string itself takes up space. This actually parallels a famous SAT question from 1982 that literally everyone got wrong for the same reason. Sometimes the simplest geometric concepts can trip up even the smartest engineers. What's really striking about the Hacker News discussion is how blown away people are by both the engineering and the presentation. Multiple commenters are saying things like, "This guy should be hired immediately," and praising his ability to explain complex concepts clearly. One person even compared his teaching style to the best professors they've had. And you know what? After watching his video, I have to agree. The production quality and clarity are exceptional. There's this interesting tension in the comments, though. One commenter, Fusion Advocate, raises a valid point about whether achieving exact gear ratios really matters that much in practice. They're questioning whether having more zeros after the decimal point actually translates to better precision in the real world, and they're concerned about how well rope will hold up over time compared to metal gears. It's a fair point. Rope can wear out, stretch, and fatigue in ways that metal doesn't. But here's what I think is the bigger picture. We're seeing individual creators working in their workshops with accessible tools, building robots that would have required entire research teams and massive budgets just a decade ago. The democratization of robotics is happening right before our eyes. Ayed isn't working for Boston Dynamics or some big tech company. He's one person with a vision, some rope, and a year of dedication. The capstan drive approach could be revolutionary for robotics. Think about it. If you can replace expensive, precision-machined gears with rope and get better performance in many metrics, that changes everything about how we might build robots in the future. Sure, there are durability questions to answer, but the potential for low-cost, high-performance robotics is huge.
And one commenter suggested that Odd might be better off as a YouTuber than working in the corporate world, but I think they're missing the point. What we need is more people like this who can both innovate and communicate. The ability to build something groundbreaking and then explain it in a way that makes thousands of people excited about engineering, that's rare and valuable. The quiet operation aspect alone could be game-changing for certain applications. Imagine service robots in hospitals or homes that don't sound like mechanical nightmares, or research robots that can observe wildlife without scaring everything away with gear noise. These aren't just incremental improvements. They're the kind of fundamental rethinks that push entire fields forward. Speaking of creative innovation and doing things differently, sometimes the best tech projects are the ones that make us smile. All right, switching gears completely here. Our next story is Tinder, but it's only pictures of my wife, and I can only swipe right. And yes, you heard that correctly. This absolutely delightful Show HN submission has captured the hearts of the Hacker News community with over 1,000 upvotes and sparked some genuinely wholesome discussions about relationships and technology. So here's the deal. Someone built an app that looks exactly like Tinder, works exactly like Tinder, except there's only one person in it, their wife. And the only option is to swipe right. It's called Tender, spelled Tender, which is just chef's kiss on the naming there. The whole thing is simultaneously a joke, a love letter, and honestly, kind of genius. What I love about this is how the community responded. You know how Hacker News can sometimes be, let's say, critically minded, but this thread is just pure joy. One user shared how they actually used it with their spouse, saying their wife was initially suspicious, like, why are you on a dating app? But then it led to, and I quote, a really great night. Another person mentioned that they've been using it for a while now, and it's become this sweet little ritual in their relationship. But here's where it gets interesting from a product perspective. People started riffing on this concept and suggesting all sorts of variations. Someone mentioned there's already an app called Kinder, Kinder, that uses the same swipe mechanic but for choosing baby names with your partner. Think about that for a second. You're both swiping on potential names, and when you match, boom, that goes on your shortlist. That's actually brilliant.
And the suggestions kept coming. People want this for choosing restaurants, for sharing trip photos, for deciding on movies to watch. Basically, taking this incredibly simple, well-understood interaction pattern from dating apps and applying it to couple decision-making. One commenter joked about making OnlyFans, but it's just my girlfriend complaining about how I load the dishwasher, which, honestly, relatable content right there. Now, there were some practical concerns raised. The trademark issue with Tinder came up naturally.
Someone pointed out that Tinder's parent company Match Group is notoriously litigious about their brand. The developer might want to watch out for that cease and desist letter. There were also some technical bugs people found. Apparently, if you swipe left by accident, which the app supposedly doesn't allow, it can cause some issues. But my favorite part of this whole discussion was this one commenter who completely misunderstood the concept and was worried about having to explain to their girlfriend why they're swiping through pictures of someone else's wife. Like, no, you're supposed to put your own partner's photos in there. The confusion itself became part of the charm of the thread. You know what this really highlights, though? Sometimes the best products aren't the ones solving massive technical challenges or disrupting entire industries. Sometimes they're just simple, sweet ideas that make people smile. This app is essentially useless from a practical standpoint. You could just, tell your spouse you think they're attractive. But it's the playfulness of it, the gesture, the effort of building something silly just to make someone feel loved. That's what resonates. And honestly, in our current tech landscape where everything feels like it needs to be about AI or crypto or the next big platform, it's refreshing to see something this pure get attention. It's a reminder that technology can be whimsical, that not every app needs a business model, and that sometimes the best hack is just making someone you love laugh. The fact that this simple joke app sparked conversations about relationship dynamics, UI patterns, and even trademark law, while also just making people go, that's the beautiful chaos of the internet right there. And you know what? We need more of this. More weird, wonderful, utterly impractical expressions of creativity and affection in our tech world.
All right, so shifting gears from our previous discussion, let's dive into something that's got the Hacker News community absolutely buzzing. Q3 Coder, Agentic coding in the world. This just dropped, and it's already racked up over 760 points with hundreds of comments, and honestly, the excitement is pretty justified. So here's the deal. Q3 Coder is this new open source coding model that's just massive. We're talking 480 billion parameters using a mixture of experts architecture, though only 35 billion are active at any given time. But the real kicker? They're claiming it performs on par with Claude Sonnet 4, and it's open source. Let that sink in for a second. An open model that supposedly matches one of the best commercial offerings out there? What really caught my attention is their approach to context handling. This thing natively supports 256,000 tokens. That's enough to understand an entire code base, and they say you can push it to 1 million tokens using something called yarn extrapolation. I mean, imagine feeding it your entire repository and having it actually understand the relationships between all your files and functions. That's kind of wild. The community response has been fascinating to watch unfold. You've got people immediately jumping in, testing it with tools like Klein and Claude Code, and many are reporting that yeah, it actually does seem to match Claude Sonnet 4's performance, especially for tool calling and complex coding tasks. One user mentioned they've been running it through its paces all day, and they're genuinely impressed. But here's where it gets interesting from a practical standpoint. The hardware requirements are, predictably, intense. People are scrambling to figure out how to actually run this thing. There's a whole thread of users working on quantized versions, compressed versions that trade a bit of accuracy for dramatically reduced memory requirements. They're talking about getting it down to run on systems with 24 gigabytes of GPU, plus maybe 128 to 256 gigs of RAM. Still hefty, but at least approaching the realm of possibility for serious developers or small teams. The pricing situation on OpenRouter is, well, it's a bit of a mess, honestly. Users are seeing prices ranging from $1 to $60, and nobody seems quite sure what's going on there. Some folks are doing the math on whether self-hosting makes sense, especially for teams that would be heavy users. It's that classic open source dilemma. Free as in freedom, but definitely not free as in beer when you factor in the hardware.
Nat, there was this really thoughtful counterpoint from a user named ZKMon that I think deserves attention. They pointed out that only about 5% of engineering time is actually spent writing code. The rest? Meetings, documentation, coordination, dealing with legacy systems, understanding requirements, all that stuff that AI can't really help with yet. So while having a super powerful coding assistant is great,
They're questioning whether it actually moves the needle that much on overall engineering productivity. It's a fair point that kind of grounds the hype a bit. And not everyone's having a perfect experience either. One user, Chislu, reported that the FP8 version through Hyperbolic was basically useless for them. Even the 4-bit quantized version, while it could do complex things like generate blog posts, struggled with actual coding work and would hallucinate methods that didn't exist. So there's definitely some variability in the experience depending on how you're accessing it. What I find most intriguing, though, is the philosophical shift they're talking about in their approach. Instead of focusing on competitive coding benchmarks like everyone else, they're saying that all code tasks are naturally well-suited for execution-driven, large-scale reinforcement learning. That's actually a pretty different way of thinking about training these models. Instead of teaching them to solve puzzles, they're teaching them to actually work with code the way developers do. The implications here are pretty significant. If open source models really can match the best commercial offerings, that changes the game for a lot of companies who maybe can't afford or don't want to send their code to external APIs. Sure, you need serious hardware to run it, but for some organizations, that one-time investment might make more sense than ongoing API costs, especially when you factor in data privacy concerns. This feels like one of those moments where the open source community is really pushing the boundaries of what's possible. The fact that we're even having conversations about running 480 billion parameter models locally, even in quantized form, shows how far we've come. A year ago, this would have been unthinkable outside of major tech companies. And finally, let's look at how individual developers navigate the business side of technology, especially when it comes to compensation and trust.
All right, now we're diving into something that's really about the business of startups, how to Firefox. And wow, this one really struck a nerve with 818 points and nearly 500 comments. This is basically a rallying cry for people to jump ship from Chrome to Firefox. And the timing couldn't be more dramatic because Google just pulled the trigger on something called Manifest v3, which, let me tell you, it's kind of a big deal. So here's what's happening. Google has essentially kneecapped uBlock Origin, which is arguably the most powerful ad blocker on the web. They're forcing everyone to use this watered-down version called uBlock Origin Lite. And when I say watered down, I mean it's basically useless. This Lite version can't even fetch updated filter lists from servers. Think about that for a second. Ads and trackers evolve constantly, right? New tracking techniques pop up daily. And if your ad blocker can't update its filters, it's like trying to fight tomorrow's viruses with last year's vaccine. The Lite version also has no element picker, that tool where you can right-click on an annoying element and just zap it away, gone. No custom filters either. And because of Manifest v3's syntax limitations, it just drops a bunch of existing filters altogether. Meanwhile, Firefox is sitting there like, hey, remember us? And according to the article, Firefox usage is actually surging again after years of decline. The author makes this passionate case that Firefox is superior because it's 100% open source. Like, the entire code base is right there on GitHub. You can inspect it, fork it, create your own browser if you want. And here's the kicker. uBlock Origin's own documentation says it works best on Firefox. The developer literally recommends Firefox as the optimal platform. But here's where it gets interesting. The community response is incredibly divided. You've got one camp saying, I've been using Firefox for years with 100 tabs open and it runs smooth as butter. And another camp going, Firefox is noticeably slower than Chrome no matter what I try. It's wild how different people's experiences are with the exact same software. And then there's this whole other layer to the discussion that I found fascinating. Some users are pointing out that Mozilla, the folks behind Firefox, aren't exactly saints either. Apparently, they've been quietly adding their own advertising features and data collection stuff that's auto-enabled by default. One commenter mentioned something about Mozilla recently adding ad tracking that you have to manually opt out of, which, yeah, that's not great for a browser that markets itself on privacy.
There's also this bigger picture concern about browser diversity that kept coming up. people are worried we're heading back to the bad old days of Internet Explorer dominance, except this time it's Chromium. Think about it. Chrome, Edge, Brave, Opera, Vivaldi, they're all Chromium under the hood. Firefox and Safari are basically the last major browsers standing that aren't built on Google's engine. And some folks are saying, look, even if Firefox isn't perfect, we need to support it just to maintain some diversity in the browser ecosystem. One particularly interesting counterpoint came from someone who said the article got iOS wrong. The article claims you can't run real browser extensions on iOS because all browsers are just Safari in disguise. But apparently there's this browser called Orion that actually runs desktop Firefox extensions on iOS, which, if true, that's pretty impressive. And then, this cracked me up. There's this one person in the comments advocating for what they call a no-browser approach. They're using HTTP generators and forward proxies, basically arguing that both Firefox and Chrome are massive overkill for most web browsing. It's like, while everyone else is debating which car to buy, this person's over here saying, just walk. The performance debate is really something, though. You've got people swearing Firefox feels snappier, especially with lots of tabs open, while others insist Chrome is noticeably faster for things like Google Meet or complex web apps. Some users mentioned specific issues like Firefox struggling with certain video codecs or having weird font rendering on Linux. What really stands out to me is how this Manifest v3 thing might be a turning point. Google basically showed their hand here. They're willing to break the most popular ad blocker to protect their advertising business, even if they dress it up as a security improvement. And that's pushing people who've been on the fence about Firefox to finally make the switch. The question is whether Mozilla can capitalize on this moment without shooting themselves in the foot with their own questionable decisions. And speaking of questionable decisions in the tech world, let's close out with a story that really hits home for anyone who's ever been promised equity in a startup. All right, so moving into something that really struck a nerve in the tech community this week, we're talking about the Windsurf employee number 2 story, where this person claims they received just 1% of what their shares were actually worth in an acquisition. And wow, with over 670 points and 520 comments on Hacker News, this one clearly hit home for a lot of people. Now, here's where it gets interesting and honestly a bit messy. The original story came from a Twitter thread that's now inaccessible, which, always makes things a bit murky. But what we do know from the discussion is that this has opened up this massive can of worms about startup equity compensation that, frankly, we need to talk about more often. The community reaction has been fascinating because it's split between people going, yeah, this is exactly why I don't trust equity packages, and others trying to piece together what actually happened here. There's even some confusion with Gary Tan from Y Combinator apparently weighing in with contradictory information, which just adds to the whole drama of it. What really caught my attention, though, is how this sparked this broader conversation about the reality of startup equity. One commenter made this point that really resonated. They said, look, when you see these big acquisition headlines like company acquired for $100 million, that number is almost always misleading. It includes things like retention bonuses that only vest if you stay for years, earnouts based on hitting impossible metrics, and, my personal favorite, synergies, which is basically corporate speak for made-up value. And then you got the preference stack issue, which, if you're not familiar with this, it's worth understanding. Basically, investors get preferred shares that get paid out first in an acquisition. So even if the company sells for what seems like a decent amount, by the time the investors take their preferred returns, there might be nothing left for common shareholders, which is what employees typically get. One person in the thread shared this brutal example, where they said, imagine your company raises $50 million at a $200 million valuation. Sounds great, right? Your options feel valuable. But then it sells for $60 million. The investors take their $50 million first, maybe with a 2x liquidation preference, so they actually take everything, and common shareholders, that's you, the employee, get zilch.
But here's what I found really compelling. There was this whole sub-discussion about whether engineers should just completely write off equity when evaluating job offers. The consensus seemed to be, pretty much treated as a lottery ticket at best. One commenter said they literally value equity at 0 when comparing offers, and honestly, based on the stories being shared, that might not be far off. Though, and this is important, there was this one person, Bravo Etch, who shared a counter story. They said they joined a startup not even understanding what options were, and it ended up being life-changing money for them. So it's not always doom and gloom, but it does seem like the exception rather than the rule.
What really got me thinking was this comment about founder ethics. Someone made the point that the most important thing when joining a startup isn't the product or the market or even the potential upside. It's whether the founders are the kind of people who will look out for their employees when the chips are down. Because, as we're seeing here, there are so many ways for employees to get screwed in these deals, and often the only thing protecting you is the founder's sense of fairness. Now, regarding Windsurf specifically, one commenter who seemed to have inside knowledge suggested this wasn't quite the horror story it appeared to be. They argued that Windsurf had no real moat, no significant IP, and was essentially acqui-hired for the talent. In that context, getting anything might have been, well, not great, but maybe not the complete betrayal it first appears to be. But that almost makes it worse in a way, doesn't it? Because it highlights how employees often don't have visibility into the real health and prospects of their company. You're working away, thinking you're building value, accumulating equity, and meanwhile, the leadership knows the company's best outcome is a talent acquisition where your shares become nearly worthless. The whole thread really drives home this uncomfortable truth about the tech industry. We've built this compensation model around equity that frankly doesn't work for most employees. And yet it persists because occasionally someone does hit it big, and those stories keep the dream alive for everyone else. It's almost like a systemic lottery that we've all agreed to participate in. And that brings us to the end of this week's journey through the top stories on Hacker News. What strikes me most about this week's discussions is how they all seem to revolve around this central tension, the promise of technology versus its reality. We started with the battle over apps versus the open web, where convenience is being weaponized against privacy. We saw how AI is fundamentally reshaping the economics of the internet, potentially destroying the very content ecosystem it depends on. We witnessed the ongoing security disasters that everyone sees coming but nobody can prevent, and the privacy paradoxes of trying to escape big tech while still depending on their hardware. But we also saw the incredible potential of individual innovation. One person with some rope revolutionizing robotics, a silly app that brings joy to relationships, and open-source AI models that might democratize advanced coding capabilities.
These aren't just technical discussions. They're conversations about trust, about control, about who benefits from the technology we build and who gets left behind. Whether it's employees getting shortchanged on equity, users losing control of their devices, or websites watching their traffic evaporate to AI summaries, there's this recurring theme of promised value that doesn't quite materialize the way we expected. The Hacker News community this week showed us that we're at multiple inflection points simultaneously. The open web is under threat, AI is reshaping everything it touches, privacy is becoming a luxury good, and the social contract between tech companies and their users and their employees is being rewritten in real time. What's clear from these thousands of comments is that the tech community is grappling with fundamental questions about the future we're building. And while there might not be easy answers, the fact that we're having these conversations, challenging assumptions, and calling out dysfunction, that gives me hope. Thanks for joining me for this week's deep dive into the top Hacker News stories. These were the conversations that mattered, the debates that raged, and the innovations that inspired from July 20th through the 26th, 2025. Until next week, keep questioning, keep building, and keep pushing for the future we actually want to see. This has been the Hacker News Weekly Podcast. I'm your host, and we'll see you next week with another curated selection of the stories that matter most to the tech community.